The train came to a halt in the barren land of Gray Hollow, releasing a thin breath of steam like a half-hearted greeting. Eleanor Harper stepped onto the platform with an old suitcase in her hand, her heart pounding from both the cold and her fear. 2 weeks of travel from Ohio had carried her far beyond distance. Alone, it had pushed her to the edge of the biggest decision of her life, becoming a mail-order bride to a man she had never met. The town before her was small, dusty, and unfamiliar. Faces passed by in silence, curious, but no one approached. Eleanor stood in the middle of the platform, searching for a familiar gaze that matched the photograph she had guarded throughout the long journey. Her hope was modest, not for grand promises, only to be welcomed with kindness, with a gentle word, with the feeling that she had not come to the wrong place. In her travel dress, let out slightly at the seams, Eleanor drew a deep breath. She knew she had brought nothing with her but a heavy past and a simple wish: to be seen as a person, not a burden. Gray Hollow promised nothing good, but for Eleanor, this was her final beginning, the place where she wagered everything on the hope that somewhere there was still room for her to belong. Eleanor recognized Ethan Collins immediately. The man from the photograph stood only a few steps away, tall and solidly built, but there was no anticipation in his eyes. When his gaze passed over her face and settled on her body, it slowed, turning cold and appraising. No smile, no greeting, just a heavy silence that was enough for Eleanor to know something was wrong. She called his name, her voice trembling from the wind and from fear. Ethan turned halfway, his expression rigid. He spoke briefly, bluntly. She was not what he had imagined. The letters, the promises of sincerity, suddenly meant nothing in the face of that harsh stare. Eleanor tried to explain, spoke of the long journey, of having nowhere left to return to, but her words fell into emptiness. "This is a mistake," Ethan said, then turned away. The wagon horses pulled off, leaving Eleanor frozen on the crowded platform, utterly alone. No one spoke, no one stepped forward. The rejection was more than words, it was a mark burned deep, reminding her that in this place she had been judged before she was ever given the chance to be heard. When the wagon finally disappeared down the dusty road, Eleanor remained motionless on the platform, as if a single movement might cause everything to collapse completely. The cold seeped through her thin dress, but the true chill came from within, from the shame of being left behind under the curious stares of strangers. No one spoke. Their silence was heavier than any cruel words could have been. At last, the station master approached. He didn't ask questions or look her over. He simply said, gently, that there was a folding cot behind the station warm enough for her to get through the night. Eleanor nodded, her throat tightening. It wasn't salvation, but it was the only lifeline left in a moment when she felt close to vanishing. As night fell, Eleanor sat on the narrow mattress, her suitcase placed at her feet like a reminder that she could be sent away at any moment. She opened it and took out the only photograph she had of her mother, along with the letter she had once written, words filled with the simple hope that being treated with kindness would be enough. Now, those lines felt painfully fragile. This time, Eleanor did not cry. She simply sat there, learning how to breathe through the pain, in a strange room, in a town that had not yet, if ever, claimed her as its own. The next morning, Eleanor woke as pale sunlight slipped through the small station window. The smell of flour and cooking smoke drew her outside, where the station master's wife was preparing breakfast. She didn't ask where Eleanor came from, nor did she wonder why she was still there. She simply handed her a bowl and showed her how to mix the dough until it felt right, how to keep the fire steady so the bread wouldn't burn. Everything unfolded naturally, as if Eleanor had belonged in that small kitchen all along. They worked in a comfortable silence. Now and then, the woman smiled and remarked that Eleanor's hands were strong, capable. The simple comment made Eleanor pause. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her without judgment. Here, she didn't need to explain herself, didn't need to justify her existence. When breakfast was finished, Eleanor stepped outside to breathe in the fresh air. The town was still dry and quiet, but something inside her had shifted. The quiet kindness of strangers couldn't erase yesterday's pain, but it placed something small back into her hands, something she had thought was lost. The feeling of being useful, of not being entirely invisible. For the first time since stepping off the train, Eleanor straightened her back. Perhaps Gray Hollow was not only the place where she had been rejected, but also the place where she began to learn how to exist without bowing her head. Eleanor met Thomas Ward by chance, at a moment when she was not prepared for anything new. He was standing beside an injured horse near the blacksmith's forge, one hand resting gently on its mane, his voice low and unhurried as if he were soothing a weary soul rather than a powerful animal. The patience in his every movement made Eleanor slow her steps, even though she had only meant to pass by. Thomas noticed her first. He did not look at her with curiosity or pity, only with a direct, warm gaze. He said that Ethan Collins was a fool, plainly and without softening the truth. The words stunned Eleanor. No one had ever stood on her side like that before, at least not without her having to ask. They exchanged names, a brief but firm handshake. Thomas didn't ask why she had been abandoned, nor did he pry into her past. He simply asked whether she planned to stay in town, as if her presence there were entirely natural. Before they parted, Thomas invited Eleanor to dinner at his home, in a tone so casual she couldn't tell whether it was an invitation or merely habitual kindness. But that was what made her heart stir a fragile feeling, like the first hint of life returning after a long winter. 2 days after their brief meeting, Eleanor stood before the wooden door of Thomas Ward's cabin, her palms damp with sweat despite the cool air. She had hesitated for a long time. His dinner invitation still echoed in her mind, no promises, no pressure, simply offered as if he believed she deserved to be asked. At last, Eleanor knocked. The small house nestled beside a line of trees, plain yet warm. Thomas opened the door with genuine surprise, then smiled when he saw her. Inside, everything was tidy, bearing the marks of a man who lived slowly and carefully. A few stacks of books, a half-finished piece of woodwork, the scent of hot food lingering in the air. There was no display, only a rare sense of calm. They ate and talked, sometimes falling into silence without awkwardness. Thomas spoke of his childhood, of the years he had spent alone. Eleanor spoke less, but every word was heard. He didn't ask questions that made her feel guarded. He was simply there close enough for her to feel safe. When Eleanor left, Thomas draped a light scarf over her shoulders and offered to walk with her into town the next day. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor realized that kindness needs no reason, it only needs someone willing to give it. The next morning, Eleanor walked into the general store with Thomas. Whispers spread at once, clinging to her footsteps like dust on the old wooden floor. She knew the feeling well, the probing stares, the judgments left unspoken. But this time, Thomas stayed at her side, calm and steady, as if the murmurs didn't exist at all. Then Ethan Collins appeared. He let slip a mocking remark, his voice low but sharp enough to cut deep. Eleanor flinched out of old habit, her body tightening as it had so many times before. But Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between her and the insult. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. He said only one thing, brief and clear. Ethan had missed his only chance, and he no longer had any right to judge or speak about Eleanor. His tone was so composed that no one dared to laugh or add to it. Ethan muttered under his breath and walked away, carrying with him the cowardice of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart racing. No one had ever defended her like that before, not out of obligation, not for honor, but simply because they believed it was right. Thomas turned back to her and said quietly that her worth had nothing to do with appearance or gossip. In that moment, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a door opening at last. For the first time, she was not only protected, but truly seen as someone who deserved respect. The days that followed passed quietly, without promises or grand gestures. Eleanor remained in Gray Hollow, and Thomas continued to appear with steady regularity, as if he were a natural part of the new rhythm forming between them. They worked side by side more than they talked, mending fences, tending the fire, preparing meals, small tasks that allowed time to gently stitch together the empty places in Eleanor's heart. With Thomas, Eleanor didn't have to be anyone else. He didn't study her with scrutiny, nor did he expect her to become a more agreeable version of herself. The silences between them weren't heavy. They were filled with trust, as though quiet itself were another form of conversation. Gradually, Eleanor noticed herself beginning to look forward to mornings, growing accustomed to having someone ask whether she had slept well, or keep her portion warm on the table. She didn't call it happiness, not yet, but something was taking root, a sense of safety, the feeling of being chosen each day, not out of pity, but out of regard. Thomas did not rush things either. He allowed affection to grow at its own pace, slow and enduring. In that calm steadiness, Eleanor learned something new. Love does not always begin with fierce passion. Sometimes, it is born from standing beside someone with whom you no longer need to be on guard. One evening, as the sunset bathed the small kitchen in gold, Thomas set his fork down and looked at Eleanor a moment longer than usual. The quiet was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. He said there was something he wanted to ask, his voice calm but serious. Then Thomas rose, opened an old drawer, and took out a leather pouch worn smooth by time. Inside was a simple silver ring, slightly misshapen but carefully polished. Thomas explained that it had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had lived through war and loss, yet always believed that hands were meant to hold, not to harm. He didn't kneel, he didn't speak of grand promises. He said only that if Eleanor was still considering leaving town, he hoped she would stay, not because he needed her, but because he wanted her. Eleanor stood silent as memories surged, harsh judgments, abandonments, the years she had believed she was too difficult to love. She looked down at her work-worn hands, then at Thomas, who had never once made her feel like a burden. He took her hand and said he was not searching for perfect gentleness, but for honesty. And for the first time, Eleanor understood that this proposal was not a cage, it was a door, one that left her free to choose. Eleanor's life after that did not turn into a loud fairy tale. The whispers in town never fully disappeared, but they no longer carried the same weight. She and Thomas lived quietly together, building a home through work, respect, and the small, repeated acts of everyday life. Eleanor did not change herself to fit the way others looked at her. She simply grew closer to who she truly was. Over time, she found work, found her place in the town, and more importantly, found her own voice. When young women stepped off the train with the same mix of fear and hope she had once carried, Eleanor was the one who stood there not to judge, but to listen. She told them that she, too, had once been rejected, labeled not enough, and that such judgments never define a person's worth. One morning, Eleanor passed by the small mirror in her home. She smiled not because she had become someone else, but because she realized she no longer needed to hide. She was loved, she was chosen, and most of all, she was seen. What about you? Have you ever been judged simply for how you look or where you come from? If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Your story might be exactly what someone needs to read today.